when I decided to do a panel about the end of the world, I like to open my panels with an AMV. And I knew immediately that there was a classic AMV from the early 2000s that was the obvious, logical one to go with. So I went with this one instead.
In the year 2520.
Yeah, I did not make this AMV, so that's credit to the person who did. For once, there was actually credits. Okay, welcome to Break the World's Shell, Anime Apocalypses as Social and Personal Revolution. I'm Jed Blue. Excuse me. Alright. I blog at mlpomo.blogspot.com. I do postmodern analysis of animation primarily. I'm just wrapping up in a few months a massive project analyzing every episode of My Little Pony Friendship's Magic. I did Madoka Magica early this year, and next year I'm going to be starting a project that is going to take me several years analyzing every episode of the DC animated universe. But I'm a longtime anime fan. I've studied this stuff, so basically this panel is going to be about the apocalypse and the apocalypse genre and where ideas about the apocalypse come from and what they mean and the kinds of metaphors that they use. Now, a warning. Works discussed in this panel have to do with the end of the world and the fall of civilizations. There are instances of child abuse, rape, incest, violent death, and massive destruction. Mention of any or all of these things may occur. Some of the works discussed in this panel have religious significance for some people. Keep in mind that we are discussing them as literature within a historical context. This is not theology, this is not a seminary, it is not my intent or my role to tell you what to believe in your religion. I am just talking about literature. Spoiler warning. Everything I spoil is either more than 10 years old or very popular and widely discussed. So, and the most recent thing I talk about is from 2011. So, this is your only warning about spoilers. The Epic of Gilgamesh is 5,000 years old, okay? If you haven't read it by now, that's your fault. And yes, I will be talking about it. A little. So let's jump in. What is the apocalypse genre? The apocalypse is not a plot device. It is a genre. There have been tales of the apocalypse for thousands of years, and they have a lineage. Each generation of them has influenced the next. They originate in a particular culture, the ancient Near East. They then spread throughout Western culture, and then as contact between Western and Eastern cultures increases, they spread east. Most cultures do not have traditional stories of the end of the world. There is no end of the world myth in, for example, Japanese folklore. There is no end of the world myth in Chinese folklore. There sort of is in the Hindu religion, but it's not the end of the world, it's passing from phase to phase of a cycle. It is specifically in the ancient Near East that we get the idea of universal destruction. And it then spreads. Apocalypse is a Greek term. It literally means revelation. It means pulling back a veil and seeing what could not previously be seen. However, because of a particular book whose Greek title was Apocalyptikos, translated into English as the Book of Revelation, and that book was about the end of the world, the term apocalypse has come to mean end of the world. In English, that is actually the older meaning. It's more recently that people have started to use the original Greek meaning for it. The literary genre started out fitting that Greek definition. It was a genre of revelations, but over time, because the most influential instance of the genre was the Book of Revelation, it became a genre about the world ending. For purposes of this panel, because this is how it shows up in anime, we're not going to use the Revelation definition. For purposes of this panel, an apocalypse is a story about or containing a catastrophe, which could be of any origin. It could be a natural disaster, it could be divine punishment, it could be something human created like a war, it could be a giant accident. But the catastrophe destroys the prevailing social structure on a setting-wide scale. What I mean is civilization is done. The social order is gone. That could be because everybody's dead and the universe has been unraveled. Or it could just be because all the cities burned and that there's scattered survivors. And this destruction is on a setting-wide scale no matter what that scale is. The scale could be an entire universe. It could be multiple universes. It could be a planet. It could be a single school. The point is that a catastrophe destroys the prevailing social structure across the entire world of the story. What isn't an apocalypse for purposes of this panel? We will not be talking about post-apocalyptic stories. Those are stories where the catastrophe occurs before the story or near the beginning of it, which means the social structures, the civilization is already gone right from the start. And the focus is on characters trying to survive or build a new society. The classic anime example of a post-apocalyptic setting is Fist of the North Star. There's tons of others. The reason we're not going to be covering them is because they're not about the catastrophe. They're about survival and rebuilding. We're also not going to be talking about disasters, disaster movies where, or stories where the catastrophe is similar to an apocalypse, though the scale might be smaller. It might not be the whole setting, and the focus is on the characters saving the social order. The reason we're not going to be focusing on that is because that is nearly every anime ever towards the end. Almost all of them have some kind of massive disaster that they're trying to stop at the finale. Sometimes more frequently than that. It's not really an apocalypse because the social order survives. Because it's not about destroying civilization, it's about proving that civilization is strong enough to survive. An example there I like is Summer Wars, where there is a huge impending disaster that they're fighting to stop, and their success in stopping it is all about showing how strong the family is as the core of civilization. You can have hybrids of these genres. I love Gurren Lagann as a hybrid because it's all three of these, of apocalypse, post-apocalypse, and disaster, but it's not in the order you expect. It starts post-apocalyptic. The first two arcs are in a post-apocalyptic setting, and then there's a time skip during which they rebuild civilization, and then you have a disaster, where there's this horrible thing coming, and they're fighting to stop it, and they succeed. Then you switch perspectives, and now they're no longer the defenders of their world's order, they're part of a much larger world, and they don't like the way it's organized, so they destroy it. So it goes from post-apocalypse to disaster to apocalypse. Let's talk about the earliest precursors to the genre. The earliest form of something resembling an apocalypse is the oldest story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, roughly 3000 BCE. This is literally the oldest piece of fictional writing that exists. Definitely there were stories before it, we just don't have them anymore. So, the gods decide that humanity is noisy and annoying. So they're going to kill us all with a giant flood. Not because we're evil, not because we're bad, just because we're noisy and annoying, and there's too many of us. The god Ea disagrees and warns a man named Utnapishtim. He instructs Utnapishtim to build a boat and load it up with samples of all living things, and then he can ride out the flood safely. And so, what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh is while Gilgamesh is on his journey, he meets Utnapishtim and talks to him. And Utnapishtim tells the story. So it's a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's not the main focus. Note that the destruction is completely arbitrary. The gods are just don't like us. There's no moral element, there was nothing wrong that they were punishing, it was just meh. And there was one god that did like us, so some of us survived. Fast forward 2,500 years to Plato and his unfinished trilogy about Atlantis. He wrote a book in which Atlantis is briefly mentioned. He wrote a sequel which is unfinished and looks to be mostly about Atlantis, and then there was going to be a third book that he never wrote. In Critias, which is the one that's mostly about Atlantis, he sets up ancient Athens, not his own Athens, but some kind of idealized Athens in the distant past, that had basically exactly matched Plato's ideas of how politics should work. And Atlantis matched his ideas of what was wrong with society. Both civilizations became very advanced, but Atlantis became really corrupt, and they decided they were going to conquer the world. So Athens put together an alliance to stop Atlantis. Sometime after this, the gods are like, you know what, these Atlantis dudes kind of suck. So we'll send a giant earthquake and a flood and sink their city into the sea. So here we have an evolution. Now, it's a political thing. It's saying, this imaginary culture has bad politics and I don't like them, and so I'm going to write a story about them being destroyed. It's sort of like writing fanfic about your bully. Which takes us to the emergence of this genre, because that's exactly what it started as, with the Book of Daniel. Now, the Book of Daniel is, of course, a book of the Bible, and it contains numerous prophecies, including a cataclysmic war, and the fall of an evil empire, and the rise of a utopia in its wake. Now, the Book of Daniel was written in a very specific moment in time. It was written during the Seleucid occupation of Israel. Basically what happened is, a couple generations after Plato, Alexander the Great conquered a huge chunk of Asia. Then he died, and his empire fell to pieces. The Jews ended up ruled by the Egyptian piece, the Ptolemies. But a couple hundred years later, during the endless wars between the fragments of this empire, the Syrian piece, the Seleucids, conquered them. Unlike the Ptolemies, the Seleucids were not tolerant of the Jewish religion. They did not want them practicing their own religion, they wanted them practicing the same religion as the rest of the Seleucid Empire. So the Jews were being oppressed, and they weren't allowed to practice their religion, and their temple was seized and taken away from them, and so on and so forth. So the Book of Daniel is written during one period of oppression, and it's set during another. It's set during what for them was the distant past, thousands of years prior, when according to their own cultures, legends, and their own beliefs, they had been taken from their homes and forced to live as second-class citizens in Babylon. And Daniel was already a cultural hero. He was a folk hero of this heroic Jew in Babylon who had prophesied the destruction of Babylon. And so this story is a reminder. It's about the fall of Babylon, but it's also saying all evil empires fall. We will be free someday, because this empire that is oppressing us will fall. And it was hugely popular. And like anything hugely popular, people wrote imitations. They are not in the Bible, but we have them. We have something like 30 or 40 different books written in the couple of centuries after this, through to the first couple of centuries CE, of dozens of Jewish and early Christian examples of this. And the thing is, we don't have a lot of documents from that period. If dozens survived, there must have been hundreds of books that were all this idea of evil empire toppled in massive apocalyptic destruction, predictions of the end of the world, all this kind of stuff. Which brings us to the all-time bestseller, Revelation. Revelation was written also in a very specific historical context, because at the time Revelation was written, there was no official Christian religion. There were a bunch of little fragments that were all quite different from each other, more different from each other, in fact, than any of the modern sects of Christianity. Massive, massive differences between them. One of the major differences was, did you have to be Jewish to be Christian? And this was a major conflict. The period we're talking about here is about 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. So we're in the next generation. Did you have to be Jewish? And the way it's written and the language in which it's written tells us the book of Revelation was written by a Jew. Which makes sense because this was a popular genre among Jews and was being mostly written by Jews. But he was a Jewish Christian. He was one of the Christians who were also Jewish. Now eventually that group lost and it was decided, no, you didn't have to be Jewish in order to be Christian. Anybody could be Christian. There was a second thing within the Jewish Christian community. Because the problem was, Roman law required you to participate in the state religion that included worship of the emperor. If anybody was at the Shinto panel last night and they were talking about state Shinto, it's the exact same idea. Worship, the leader is a god and everyone is required to officially believe it. You don't have to really believe it, you just have to do it. And that helps keep cohesion of the state between all these diverse beliefs. Jews had a special dispensation. They were exempted from this requirement under law until they attempted to rebel. Then the Romans destroyed their temple and said, no, you do have to obey this. So within the Jewish Christian community, because of course Christians are also forbidden to worship other gods, there was this debate. Should we pretend and participate in the state religion, or should we withdraw from Roman society and become outlaws and refuse? Crap. Oh, thank God. But why are you playing? You should not be playing. And that is the context in which we get the book of Revelation. And so it's once again, we are being oppressed. This evil empire is ruling us and forcing us to follow their religion. So here's a story about the destruction of an evil empire, which, as always, is Babylon. It's the go-to evil empire for this early stages of the genre. But they're talking about Rome. And they're talking about the destruction of the world, and what they're saying is that the wrath of God will destroy these oppressors, they will reward the faithful, we will be free. And this is key to understanding this genre. In the apocalypse genre, for thousands of years, up until the 19th century, or the 20th century actually, the destruction was a political event. It was the overthrow of a corrupt system. It was the end of oppression. It was the upending of hierarchies. Your boss that you hate isn't going to be your boss anymore because civilization is over. It was about the rise of a new, better order. Apocalypse is not a genre of fear and despair. It's a genre of hope. It's saying all these awful things will be destroyed. So by the end of the first century, it's solidly established as a genre about anger at the system, faith and hope that things will be better. It is heavily metaphoric and coded, like Babylon standing in for whatever empire you're actually dealing with. Or number games are very popular in them. Going back to Daniel has a riddle, Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, that Daniel has to interpret. That's actually a form of number play. And that became very popular. Riddles, puzzles built into the story. It predicts the end of an evil order and the creation of a better world. Let's fast forward a couple thousand years. Let's talk about one that had a huge, huge influence on anime. The War of the Worlds. This is the classic novel of Martian invasion. This is the first ever story of aliens invading the Earth. It is the first alien invasion. It is the first instance of giant mecha. That thing over there is the first ever idea of a giant mechanical thing that walks around and is shaped like its pilot. It's lacking the beak, the legs are a little long, but if you read the description of what Martians look like, that's actually what they look like in the book. That's a huge influence on anime. Arguably, it's also the origin of tentacle monsters. You've got erotic art from the 19th century in Japan, but that always depicts animals. This is the first case of an otherworldly being with tentacles. Now, the question is it about the destruction of the social order? Because at the end of the novel, the Martians are defeated, and it is ambiguous. They have been totally curb-stomping Britain for the entire book. But it's ambiguous as to whether Britain is totally annihilated and we're now in a post-apocalyptic setting going to have to rebuild, or if the idea is, no, actually, like, the state and the order survived and rebuilding is going to be relatively easy. However, if you look at the biography of H.G. Wells, if the dude were alive today, he would have a Tumblr and people would accuse him of being a social justice warrior. Wells, Wells outright states in chapter 1 that what the Martians are doing to Britain is no different than what Britain did to Africa. He was a socialist. He was a staunch opponent of racism. He was an opponent of two very popular ideas among intellectuals in his time, eugenics and social Darwinism. He thought they were both evil and horrifying. So what we have here is still that same concept from the apocalypse genre, the angry, yeah, see how you like it. Yeah, you think you're so big, pushing people down. See how you like it when somebody bigger than you comes along and smashes you. Let's move on to something else that's been hugely influential on anime and is much less well known. Damian, the story of Emil Sinclair's youth. This is a novel by Hermann Hesse. It's very short. It's like 100 pages, 120. And it is completely non-fantastical. Like, there is no fantasy element to this. It is the story of a boy growing up. And Emil is deeply conflicted between conforming to the rules of society around him, which he sees as being good, and his own desires and potential and what he feels he has to offer the world, which doesn't fit in. And he's drawn into this friendship with a very charismatic older boy named Damian. And it is so easy to do a queer reading of this. It's dripping with homoeroticism. If there is not a yaoi adaptation of this, or I guess technically it would be BL, I would be astounded because this is the origin of the uke and seme. Demian is strong and proud and independent, and he rejects the notion of good and evil. He believes that if you are truly true to yourself, you don't need a moral code imposed on you by society, because you will never want to do bad things to other people because you are fully developed in yourself and satisfied with yourself. Then World War I happens. And if you're not familiar with the history of World War I, it was the destruction of Europe. It was the end of the old order. Empires fell, several of them, and never rebuilt. There were towns that lost their entire male population because they were all sent to the front. Give a random example. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote about how he and 4 friends of his all went off to war together, and he was the only one that came back. So he wrote them into The Lord of the Rings as the Hobbits. It was a massive, massive, massive change. But what's interesting is that World War I happens entirely off stage in this novel. It happens between the second to last and last chapter. Because it's no longer about civilization and the evil empire and our people being oppressed. It's personal. It's, I want to fulfill my potential as a human being. I want to be reborn as a new and better person, so my personal world needs to be destroyed and reborn. Now, does this have an influence on anime about the apocalypse? Well, let me put it this way. In the course of the novel, Damian teaches Emil about a new religion, the worship of Abraxas, who is the god of both good and evil. He is the supreme being of both at once. And this is how the core tenets of the religion are explained to Emil. I'm going to quote the book. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. Oh, and it's a little hard to hear because it's pretty quiet, but the musical track that's playing right now, if you get the official soundtrack and translate the Japanese title of it, it translates to That God's Name is Abraxas. Yes, this had an influence on anime about the apocalypse. So, let's talk about anime about the apocalypse, because that's really what we're all here for. And I'm making perfect time. Excellent. Akira. Akira is a massive... Akira almost single-handedly created American anime fandom. American anime fandom was this tiny thing that existed within science fiction conventions. They would, be off in the corner watching their weird robot cartoons. And then this movie happened, and this movie actually had a theatrical release in the US. Awesome. And suddenly, people were like, wait, you mean cartoons aren't all that He-Man G.I. Joe crap? There's stuff like this? And anime fandom really began to grow at that point. Now, Akira is very much about anxious power. It opens with images of how broken society is. And their society is a little ways in the future from ours, but not that different. And it's incredibly broken in a lot of ways. We see images of protesters, of police brutality, of biker gangs, of this weird cult. All this stuff building together to give an image for the first 10 or so minutes of the movie that this society is deeply sick. People want the apocalypse in this setting. The military commander talks about how much he meant, because there had been a massive disaster that almost destroyed the city in the past, and they'd rebuilt. And the military commander talks about how much he misses the rebuilding. Because when they were rebuilding, everybody worked together, and they all came together, and there was hope, and people were working hard, and there was cooperation. And then once they finished rebuilding, that's when all the old rivalries and the politics started to happen, and all these things, and he sees the new society as corrupt and decadent and broken. He's wishing for the apocalypse. On the opposite side, the Akira cult is praying for Lord Akira to rise up and destroy everything so that all this corruption can be ended, all this oppression coming from the military can be ended. People want this world to end, and they are rewarded with this world ending. However, we have two characters who are represented as hope for this city, Kei and Kaneda. Kei is a terrorist. Kaneda is a member of a biker gang. Leader of a biker gang, in fact. But they survive, and they fight, and they try and fail to prevent the destruction of this city and the military and its order, but they're alive. And at the end of the anime, the two of them are standing together with a new world, because now everything has been wiped away. Simultaneously, we get another new world, one that's explicitly talked about, that Akira and Tetsuo leave our universe to create their own. So again, we have this notion of destruction, but following destruction comes rebirth. We have this notion of hope. Next series I'm going to talk about. This is the anime about the apocalypse. Like, how many people hearing about this panel, okay, well, I titled it after Utena, so that was probably one. But other than that, I mean, it's this. This is the anime about the end of the world. So we've got humans fighting angels. And at first, we're told that the humans are trying to stop the angels from destroying humanity. But as time goes on, we find out this is a lie. They're fighting over who gets to end the world, because that's going to be who's in charge of the new world. Again, we have everyone wants the world to end. No one is happy with the world as it is. They want it to be destroyed and transformed, but they want to be in charge of the new world. They want to shape it to what they want it to be. But the TV series does something interesting, because it goes down that Damian route. It makes the apocalypse it takes the apocalypse off stage, and it makes the end of the series about one person. It gives Shinji the realization that his personal world not the political world, but his personal world in which he feels weak and inferior, and he's always angry, and he's always sad. He has the power to destroy that world and create a new one by acting differently, thinking differently, changing himself, growing up. This is very much ideas from, it's actually two sources that are basically the same thing. The Neo-Stoic philosophers and what's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea in both is that your feelings do not come from the events around you, they come from how you think about the events around you. If you can train yourself to think differently, you will feel differently. If your response to something bad happening is, oh no, this is terrible, then you will feel bad. If your response is, this is a challenge that I have the skills to overcome, your response may be to feel excited. Basically, Damian was heavily based on Jungian notions of how you grow up. Evangelion is taking almost exactly the same idea and just substituting a different school of psychology. And it's both cases, the end of the world is the end of childhood. You're substituting an adult world for a world of children. Speaking of personal apocalypses, Revolutionary Girl Utena. For those of you who came in after, this is Rosa Versailles plus Sailor Moon plus Damian equals this. Then mix it with huge amounts of fairy tales and stir it up and and have some fun. Now, this is the story of Utena and Anthe. This is a story of forbidden love. This is a Yuri story. They just don't kiss until the compilation movie. But it is. It is also, however, it's not just forbidden love. It's also about this concept of the princess and the witch, the good girl and the bad girl. It's the same idea as Damian. They're told you have to be one or the other. Both of them are told you have to be one or the other. And the result is that Anthe bounces back and forth between being the princess in need of rescue and the wicked witch who makes other people in need of rescue. Because neither of them is who she really is, but those are the only two roles that the society around her permits. Utena rejects that. She says, no, I'm not going to be either of those. I'm going to be a girl who's a prince. I'm going to rescue princesses. But over the course of the series, Utena learns that it's wrong to be the prince. Not because she's a girl, but because that approach of saving other people, taking care of other people, is inherently demeaning to those other people. It's controlling. Utena doesn't see the people around her. She sees what she expects them to be. But over the course of the series, she comes to see that Anthe isn't the princess in need of rescue. She's a fully realized human being. And in the process, Anthe is able to realize that she's a fully realized human being. And they are both able to evolve and become something new and grow up. Now the question, is there an apocalypse? And I would answer yes. Remember, I said at the beginning, the apocalypse is setting-wide. In this case, the entire show is within one school. And the final duel encompasses the entire school. The system that dominates this school, Akio's power, the dueling, the Rosebride duels, are toppled. So for the purposes of this story, the school is the world and its civilization falls at the end. And this is treated as a glorious and triumphant victory. Because it is. This system sucked. So there's 3 transformations that happen. And that's what's revolutionary about this series, pardon the pun, is that it adds a third thing that the apocalypse can do. There's a personal revolution, as in Damian, for Utena and Anthe. There's a social revolution, as in the traditional apocalypses, for Atori Academy. And there's a narrative revolution. The series attacks fairy tales. It says fairy tale romance is sick. That's one of the reasons, like the fact that the director of this came straight off Sailor Moon, Tuxedo Mask is everything wrong with fairy tale romance. He sucks. He's awful, and he's a perfect traditional fairy tale knight in shining armor. So far, at least. I should say I've only seen what's out of Sailor Moon Crystal. But so far, I keep going, oh my god, Tuxedo Mask is everything wrong with the knight in shining armor. He's up to kissing unconscious women. Don't do that. So it's attacking and destroying and trying to come up with new ways to tell stories. Let's move on to another series. Who here's seen this? Not many people. I had never heard of this. I told my friend that I was doing a panel on the apocalypse, and she said, you must watch Psychonaut for it. Psychonaut is a teen romance story. It is about two kids in high school who fall in love and go through the trials and tribulations of first love. Except that there's an apocalyptic war happening, and at the beginning it's very far away. But as the series goes on, the war moves farther and farther in until it is the dominant storyline. Shisei, that's her, is the ultimate weapon. She is taken and transformed so that she has the power to basically sprout mecha parts and shoot missiles and all that kind of stuff. She is no longer a human being. She no longer has a heartbeat. She is now more machine than person, even though when she's in her kind of non-combat mode, she still looks the same. She did not agree to be the ultimate weapon. We never find out why she was chosen to be the ultimate weapon. The military just came to her house one day, pulled her out, did massive surgery to her, and then sent her home with instructions that when they call her, she has to come and fight their enemies. This is a massive violation of her body and of her consent. And she responds like a rape survivor. She severely dissociates. What I mean is, when she is in combat mode, she blacks out. She very often has no memory of what she did while she was fighting. She feels like she's that's a different alien person. Her personality alters when she's in that mode. And she begins lashing out violently. She begins to develop this attitude of, I'm killing people either way, who cares which side they're on. And she becomes, hang on, sorry. Lost my place in my notes. Okay. And she's plagued by intense guilt. She has massive, massive guilt issues. Meanwhile, Shuji, the boy in this story, we find out fairly early on, they never use the word abuse, they never use the word rape, but we find out early on, he, in middle school, had sex with his track coach. And he, more subtly, responds like a sexual abuse victim. He has a subtler form of dissociation, but it's still dissociation. Whenever things become emotionally intense, he becomes really easily distracted. They'll be having an intense conversation about their relationship, and we see his point of view, and he's like watching the bus go by, getting distracted. He has massive trust and intimacy issues. Again, never explicitly stated, but it's really obvious as you watch this series that he is afraid to have sex with her. And which leads into the other one, sexual dysfunction. There's a strong implication that he eventually, meets again with his old track coach, and she's still a complete sexual predator. And there's some implication that he can't. And the war throughout this is functioning as a metaphor for Shuji and Shisei's relationship. The military keeps taking Shisei away so that she can fight in the war, which serves the same function in the teen romance plot that, say, her father who doesn't like her dating him and won't let her see him. It's filling that same role. Frequently, their guilt and anxiety takes external form in the war. Instead of being shown in the characters, it's shown in the characters, but it's paralleled in the war. So, for example, when Shuji's old track coach comes back and manipulates him into sleeping with her, which is an incredibly hard sequence to watch, that's when she's called away to the front. When Shisei then cheats on Shuji, there's an earthquake in their town that's caused by all the bombing. Like every time one of them is feeling guilty or anxious or does something bad about the relationship, something bad in the war affects the other one. And at the end, they finally break through their issues. They finally are able to fully be together, and the result is the end of the world. The result is rampant destruction of everything until all that is left is the two of them in a dream world that exists only within Shujei's imagination. It's still Chisei, she effectively downloads herself into him, but it's the two of them in an imaginary world. So again, this reality that was oppressing them, that was abusing them, that was making them unable to fully express their feelings is wiped away and replaced with one where they can be together and they can be themselves. A new reality where happiness and love are possible for them. Puella, Magi, Madoka, Magica. The apocalypse keeps happening. The series opens with a dream of apocalypse to come. It opens with the destruction of the city by Walpurgisnacht. In the course of the series, we see multiple apocalypses because every time Homura resets the timeline, she's abandoning a world to destruction. And at the end, we get apocalypses. We get a social revolution because we've got that princess-witch dichotomy going on again, just like in Utena. The magical girl is pure and happy and hopeful and suffers terribly. She's the princess, the damsel in distress, while the witch is destructive and cruel and evil and horrifying. But they're both the same person. And Madoka effectively destroys the concept of witch. She makes it so that there are never witches in the world ever again. And in the process, she destroys the evil, oppressive system of Kyubey that causes this princess-witch dichotomy. But she doesn't do it completely. She ascends. She becomes the pure essence of the princess side of the dichotomy. The goddess of hope. Pure and untouchable and eternally taking on the suffering of others. That means only half of this constraining reality that has been destroyed. Kyubey is still in charge in the new world. It's just slightly less horrible, slightly less controlling and destroying the magical girls. Which is why a new apocalypse, a new revolt, a rebellion, if you will, is still necessary at the end of the series. But because Rebellion has not had a wide US release, I'm not going to talk about it in the panel. Cool, this filled the time exactly. The last thing I want to say is I just want to reiterate again. The whole idea of the apocalypse genre is that this is not a genre of despair, this is not a genre of fear. This is not about, oh no, the end of the world is nigh, be afraid. This is about, what this genre is about is the world in which we live sucks. But nothing lasts forever. The world in which we live, the society in which we live, constrains us and confines us and oppresses us. But it will pass, it will change, it will be swept away, and there will be something new. The apocalypse genre is about anger, faith, and hope. Okay. So, if you want to take a picture of this, you can. On the left is all the works I talked about. On the right, recommendations for further reading. John Collins' The Apocalyptic Imagination is about the emergence of the apocalypse genre in the ancient Near East. Michael White's From Jesus to Christianity is about early Christianity in general, but it does cover some of the ideas I'm talking about multiple conflicting sects and the context in which the Book of Revelation came out. Glenn Yeffeth edited a book about the War of the Worlds. It's got a bunch of different perspectives on it, including as an apocalyptic work. Europe Between the Wars is an excellent, excellent book about how World War I destroyed Europe. Susan Napier's Akira, Revenge of the Abjected in Anime from Akira to Howl's Moving Castle. One of the best things ever written about Akira. I am not a huge fan of Susan Napier. I think most of the rest of that book isn't very good, but that one article is brilliant. If you want to learn more about cognitive behavioral therapy, Gillian Butler and several other people. If you want to learn more about this idea of the princess and the witch, about the Madonna horror complex, which is the technical term for it, Kate Millett. And I've got a book on Madoka coming out later this year called The Very Soil. Anybody wants cards or contact info or anything, I have them. I just need to pull them out. Thank you all. I don't think there's another panel after this, so we've got a couple minutes, so if anybody has any questions. Did you have a question?